Austin Gonzalez, who's a member of the National Political Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America, joining us here on the Freedom Side. Austin, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I am very happy to have you. And, DSA, you all have come out, you put out a statement regarding the war. The White House was attacking you. And I want to get into some of that, but I don't want to be guilty of many of your critics, which was to caricature your statement. So before we get into it, what did DSA put out? What have you been saying about this conflict?
Absolutely. Thank you, Eugene. There's so many things to unpack here. I'd have to say during my entire time in leadership within DSA, this is the first time the White House has attacked us directly, which to me is a disturbing sign of how jingoistic things have become, right? And unpacking the statement that we released itself, right? Our statement condemned the Russian invasion, right? In very strong terms, right? What seems to have bothered people is our rhetoric referencing NATO expansionism, right? Which to me is an impossible part of this entire scenario to ignore, right? It's been shocking to me, honestly, to see how many people I've seen outright defend NATO, right? Talk about how, well, no, NATO's role in this is important in protecting people. I'm just like, excuse me? We're in a very, I don't want to get too hyperbolic here, right? But I feel like we're in a very dark place when we're seeing leftists or whatever we want to call it defending NATO, right? I thought anti-NATO was a very run-of-the-mill position for any sort of socialist, right? For any sort of anti-imperialist, right? And something I like to say is you can't call yourself a socialist if you're not an anti-imperialist, right? And if you're going to be an anti-imperialist, that means opposing NATO. So I was very proud to see my organization, Democratic Socialists of America, forcefully reject both NATO, reject the invasion from Russia, right? I think it's very important to talk about these situations with context, right? And not to look at these sorts of situations so binary, right? So black and white, right? Like it's amazing how many people I see that are like embracing these weird like World War II, like Sudetenland fantasies. I'm just like, do you guys know what's actually happening here, right? Have you been following this situation at all before the last 3 months? But yes, it was remarkable to me to see even the White House coming out and attacking DSA. But once again, as a member of a socialist organization, I lean on the great socialist Eugene Debs himself, who very proudly stood up against World War I, which I think is important for any socialist to do.
Well, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, on top of the White House rapid response guy attacking DSA, there's also been a couple think pieces from various outlets. I know recently today it was all on Twitter, New York Magazine. Someone from New York Magazine came after DSA, which was interesting because I don't think anybody was quoted from DSA, just the critics were quoted, which included, like, I think the New York Post was one of the outlets that came after you and attacked you. But it does seem like, we're always told the left is so irrelevant in the US. They don't even matter. DSA is so dumb. It doesn't even matter. It has no power. So I think it also speaks to some level of power or fear of power that the left does or can have in the US, that someone from the White House felt the need to attack DSA, that so many different outlets feel the need to try to police the left's position on this issue. And, I'm the biggest pessimist in the world. So when I see a glass half full, it means something. But I'm curious your thoughts on that. Do you think this speaks to some level of perhaps, power that the left has, maybe more than it thinks it has, if a DSA statement can cause this much controversy?
I 100% agree with those sentiments, Rania. And I've even told a lot of my fellow DSA members, right? To me, it's exactly what you just said there. This is a sign of our power, right? And not just DSA, the movement, right? This is a sign of the power of the movement, the importance of what you guys do right here with Breakthrough News, right? I feel like during my entire time as a leftist, as an anti-imperialist, I've seen a real blossoming of the movement within the last 5 to 10 years, right? And the liberal media, whatever we want to call it, is taking notice. Literally, the White House is taking notice. To me, that is absolutely a sign of our power, right? And to me, I look at that as not, to me, that's why I say getting attacked, that isn't the time to now hide from our anti-NATO position. No, that's when we double down on it, right? That's when we tell people why we're anti-NATO, right? Which is in the DSA national platform, I should say, right? U.S. withdrawal from NATO, that is, right? This is an important time to educate people on NATO, right? When people are actually paying attention to what's happening here, right? And because we have this power, this platform, because people are attacking us, it's because of that platform, right? Because people know, oh, there's an actual movement here raising awareness on NATO, right? Referencing NATO's crimes in Libya, right? We saw what happened 10 years ago, right? You're trying to tell me that NATO intervention is going to help the Ukraine? Are you serious? Like, this is why I say, like, it's amazing to me how many people, and I try not to get too cynical, right? You refer to yourself as a pessimist there, Ronnie, right? Try not to get too cynical, but the amount of people I've seen in the last 3 months have very strong opinions about NATO and everything that I haven't seen them ever express before is very curious to me. But once again, getting to the central point here, once again, I think this is absolutely a sign of our power, but not just DSA. Like I say, the whole greater socialist, anti-imperialist movement, whatever we want to call it. And I think it's so critically important for us to be coming together right now, because I expect the attacks to just increase. They're not going away anytime soon. These attacks are going to escalate, right? And it's going to be critically important to be being there for each other, to be amplifying each other's messages and making sure that people are not being singled out as pro-Putin, whatever that means. It's once again, the word shocking comes to mind, that any sort of criticism of NATO is interpreted as, oh, so you're pro-Russian fascism, whatever that even means, right? This has literally nothing to do with Putin. This is about recognizing that NATO expansionism brought us to this point unequivocally. Even the DSA International Committee put out a couple of tweets earlier today referencing how this position that NATO expansionism was going to provoke a response from Russia is something that was maintained by some of the most hard-right intelligence analysts during the 90s. This is nothing shocking or new or radical. It's a basic fact. But yeah, that's some people struggle to accept that, it seems.
You got that right. That's for sure. And we still have Walter Smolarek with us from the Answer Coalition. But I certainly comment on whatever you like, Walter. But I mean, I'm curious your thoughts on a similar point that it's possible to walk and chew gum at the same time. We can have a sophisticated analysis that touches on a number of things, but it's also possible to build real opposition in this moment to escalation. We don't just have to despair.
Yeah, I think that's completely true. That's completely true. And it's more important than ever because this is such an unbelievably dangerous situation. I mean, this involves the two main nuclear armed powers in the world. I mean, even though it's a difficult moment right now for the anti-war movement, it's also a crucially important one. And I completely agree with the points that Austin was making. I mean, the idea that somebody could consider themselves progressive or even a socialist and think anything positive about NATO whatsoever, just it's shocking, right? I mean, NATO was a military alliance that was conceived, founded in order to annihilate socialism militarily. I mean, that's what NATO was all about. It was so that when World War III comes around, I mean, this was the founders of NATO's thinking. When World War III rolls around, all of us major capitalist world powers need to be on the same team to destroy the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. And it maintained that offensive character all throughout its existence, including after the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, of course, it's a big part of this great power competition strategy that the Pentagon has, which says that, China and Russia are like the number one targets on our hit list. And it's also been used to, inflict horrific suffering on the peoples of the former Yugoslavia, of Afghanistan, and most recently Libya. And I think that's another important point that Austin raised. I mean, if anybody thinks that NATO intervention could possibly have a positive or progressive outcome for a targeted society, look at what happened in Libya. That was sold to the public in a lot of similar ways, right? Like there's a besieged people, there's this horrible dictator Gaddafi, and he's going to massacre his own people. And we, the West, NATO, have a responsibility to protect. And what was the consequences? I mean, there was a horrific war, and the fabric of Libyan society was so shredded that, I mean, even the slave trade reemerged in Libya. I mean, it was an unmitigated disaster for the people there. And that's been the case anywhere the United States or NATO or any of its junior imperialist partners have intervened. Nothing that they do will lessen the suffering of the people of Ukraine or bring desperately needed peace to the people of Ukraine. Actually, the only thing that the United States could possibly do to improve the situation is make an ironclad pledge that NATO will not expand anymore, or better yet, abolish NATO altogether. I mean, that's the only contribution to peace that the United States could possibly make at this moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to ask you both a question. Walter, I'll start with you since I have you here. I think the rumor is that President Biden is going to ask for $800 billion for the Pentagon this year. I think he sort of set the stage for that with his State of the Union speech. I mean, talk about this. Again, Walter, I'll start with you, but I want both your thoughts on this. I mean, what is the impact of this kind of spending on working class people in this country? I mean, when people hear these huge numbers, I think it can seem kind of abstract. But what does it really mean to spend $800 billion on the Pentagon in 2022?
Oh, it's a disaster. It's an unmitigated social disaster, both for the people who are on the receiving end of those weapons and for people here in the United States. I mean, there are so many crises working class people are facing: the lack of affordable housing, the lack of good schools, lack of health care. The basic material things that you need to live a life with dignity are denied to so many tens of millions of people inside the United States. And yet there's $800 billion. When you add everything together, everything that's hidden in other parts of the budget, it's really more like $1 trillion or more than $1 trillion just in 1 year, on things that have no value other than being used to destroy and kill people in other countries. It's completely a shock and an outrage. The Biden administration had this like Build Back Better social program expansion that they wanted to do, and it fell apart, right? And by the way, I mean, this was another thing that I was thinking about when we were talking about the White House's attack on the DSA. I mean, they had nothing but positive things to say about Joe Manchin, the guy who sunk their domestic policy, and yet they feel the need to attack the DSA. I mean, it shows how aggressive they are when it comes to targeting the left, and how completely nonchalant they are when it comes to going after the right. But anyway, I mean, I think that the social costs of this society economy based on militarism are enormous, and ending that militarism would have huge dividends, not just for the peoples around the world who would get the U.S. boot off of their neck, but also for working class people here who would not have to foot the bill for this horrific blood-soaked empire that's in every corner of the world.
Austin, I am curious your thoughts about the same question. If it does turn out to be true, the impact of this just unbelievable militarism, $800 billion potentially for the Pentagon.
No, that's a wonderful question there. And I'm going to echo a lot of the sentiments already said. But one thing I would just want to say at the top about this important question is this: why I say to see so many liberals, leftists, progressive, or whatever we want to call it, coming out and being pro-NATO is a gift to the military industrial complex, right? It's a gift, right? This gives them that mandate, at least in their heads, to do things like this, right? And say, oh, well, you see, the people are demanding it, right? No, they love our bloated military budgets. These are good things, right? So it's once again, it's disastrous to see that sort of rhetoric from as many people that I've seen it. But getting to the crux of this issue, right? I just echo a lot of those sentiments, right? Like, the more bloated our defense budget is, right, the less there is to spend on social programs here in the United States, right? A point I love to make to a lot of my friends within DSA or within the movement or wherever is that we can't ever expect to get to a place where we can have fully funded social programs for the working class, such as Medicare, until we take apart our defense budget fundamentally, right? As long as we're pouring so many resources into this, it's going to make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to even have those sort of fully funded social programs. Those conversations are directly linked. They're directly linked, right? Which is why I say you cannot be a socialist without being an anti-imperialist, right? You cannot help the poor if you are not first attacking the empire, right? The empire which is funded by the United States, right? Which, as mentioned, has its boots on the necks of people across the world, right? It's shocking to me, once again, that word shocking, right? It's shocking to me when I see how much rhetoric or in this case, funds could potentially go to the Ukraine. What about Yemen? What about Afghanistan? We've just moved on completely. Who cares, right? Just let those people suffer, right? There's a reason, right, why these budgets get inflated, right, and why no sort of conversation is ever made about how we're going to help the people in Yemen and Afghanistan, because once again, those are the people whose boots we have on their necks, right? So like it's once again, it's stunning to me to see people move on from those conversations and zero in on this conversation in the Ukraine once again, as if these are isolated incidents, right? When they are all connected, they're all related to each other. You cannot have success or freedom for one sector of the working class and completely ignore others, right? The working class is international, right? And unless you're actually uplifting the international working class, which includes Ukrainians, which includes Yemenis, which includes Afghans, which includes people here in the United States, it's not proper socialism, right? Which is once again why socialism and anti-imperialism are intricately linked.
And also includes Russians. And that's something that is like, I mean, obviously, the people who are experiencing the most immediate impact of what's happening right now are Ukrainians, because that's where this war is happening. But the US has just unleashed a massive campaign of economic warfare against Russians. And they're openly saying it. They're openly saying that, like you heard Hillary Clinton openly say that, unfortunately, Russian people are going to have to suffer. I'm paraphrasing, but that's almost exactly what she said when she was talking about the necessity of these sanctions. And so, I'm curious how you perceive people reacting to the issue of sanctions as well. Because, it's one thing to say, let's not give weapons here and there and add fuel to the fire. But we've seen in the last 10 years or so that sanctions have become the primary weapon of U.S. empire against so many countries. I think a third of the world at this point is impacted by U.S. sanctions, if not more, now that Russia has been put under such extreme, economic strangulation. But do you guys find, I guess, in the kind of work that you do, I know, probably for you, Austin, it's more on a political level, and Walter, it's more on an, organizing level. But do you find the issue of sanctions being something that people are receptive to? Maybe I'll start with you, Austin, in terms of politics, since DSA does end up endorsing politicians. Is this an issue that you find potential candidates being receptive to having on their agenda as something that they will adamantly oppose?
Another wonderful question and a lot to unpack here, right? First, I just want to make clear that anti-sanctions language is also in the DSA national political platform, right? But the sad reality when dealing with the U.S. government, when dealing with politicians of the United States, is that a lot of people are backward on this issue, right? And not just this issue, foreign policy in general, right? Referencing the military-industrial complex, they run DC, right? They absolutely run DC. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that aspect, and a lot of work that we've begun to do in that aspect to get people to forcefully oppose sanctions in DC more often, because I think it's important to point out that sanctions don't work, right? Sanctions don't work, right? Even quote unquote targeted sanctions. I love that phrase. It's hilarious to me, right? Sanctions don't work, right? Sanctions are, no matter what phrase you want, no matter how many adjectives you want to place in front of it, sanctions are designed to hurt a country's economy, right? And what does that mean? That means it's going to hurt a country's working class. And what does that mean? That you're starving poor people, right? And not only are you starving poor people, if you hate Putin so much, right? Hey, I'm no fan of Putin, right? You're only emboldening people to his cause, right? You're only furthering people to say, hey, yeah, it is the United States that's choking us. That's messed up, right? If you actually want to help the Russian people, right, or do whatever, right? Sanctions are only going to make the situation worse, right? And especially in this situation in particular, I see the call for sanctions or targeted sanctions as deeply irresponsible, right? This is a heightening of escalations. Sanctions are an act of war, right? We're talking about endorsing acts of war during this situation. What we should be calling for is diplomacy, right? De-escalation, not escalation. And sanctions only make these sorts of situations worse, right? So sanctions fundamentally are an act of war and should be, once again, should be opposed by any actual principled anti-imperialists.
Walter.
I'm curious, Walter, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing I would add to that is that, sanctions aren't an alternative to killing people. That's something that I think that's, a persistent myth that's put out there by people who are really for U.S. imperialism, but just a softer, gentler form of U.S. imperialism. Sanctions absolutely kill people. I mean, you can die because a bomb is dropped on you, or you can die because you can't access essential medicine that you need to stay alive. I mean, the outcome is the same. Sanctions are completely brutal. We can see what happened to Venezuela, for instance. I mean, tens of thousands of people have died by some estimates in Venezuela because of the economic blockade imposed on that country by the United States, and using its position on top of the world capitalist system. Wall Street reigns supreme over almost every other sector of the economy in the United States and around the world by leveraging that that power, that unjust, ill-gotten wealth that they've accumulated to cause suffering and deny essential goods to people around the world. That's, in a way, that's just as cruel as shooting a missile at somebody or shooting somebody with a gun. I mean, it's something that can be, absolutely deadly on a massive scale. And if you, are, as one should be, right, repulsed by the idea of the violence of warfare, the human suffering that it involves, you should be just as opposed to economic warfare, popularly called sanctions.
Well, certainly well taken points on both fronts. I can say that for sure, but I really appreciate both of you joining us. It was a pleasure to be able to have this conversation. Austin Gonzalez of the Democratic Socialists of America, Walter Smolarek of Act Now to Stop War and End Racism, also known as the Answer Coalition. Thank you both so much for giving us some of your very valuable time here on the Freedom Side.